no face mask is nice and dry. Luckily, after a bit of pulling and prying, I was able to get this off of the original template. So I can reuse this again, luckily. But I am gonna continue working with this mask on here, because I'm gonna add a second layer because I feel like this is a little bit thin. And it's a little bumpy and more textury than I like. So I'm gonna plunk her back on here to keep the shape. And I am going to put a second layer of paper mache clay on here, but I'm going to use a different recipe this time that is supposedly a little more smooth. So I'm going to give that a go now, and that is going to be the next step. I'm using basic unbleached flour. It doesn't really matter what you use. I just use the cheapest stuff available. I'd stay away from anything like whole wheat and this and that. Cheap white flour works just fine. This is a basic white glue. I'm using Elmer School glue, but you can use pretty much any white glue. You can use any type of cornstarch you like, doesn't really matter brand or any of that, just cornstarch. Any old basic toilet paper will do. I just use the really cheap brand stuff for this. I don't really find a difference in any. So yeah, sacrifice toilet paper roll. But you can also use soaked newspaper as well if you prefer. That's entirely up to you. I just find it's easier to break the fibers down in toilet paper. Mineral oil, baby oil, whatever you want to call it. Again, brand doesn't matter, choose anything you like. This isn't necessary, but I do find it does a difference in this particular recipe. It just changes the texture a little bit, makes it a little smoother. This is the most important part of the recipe for creating the strength of the paper mache clay. This is the joint compound. Now make sure when you buy this that it is pre-mixed. Don't buy the powdered sort. It just adds complication to the recipe, and it is much easier to use this as it's already pre-mixed. There are multitudes of different brands you can try, but for my accessibility, I have found that this Certainteed all-purpose brand has worked the best for me. The first thing you're going to want to do is soak a bunch of toilet paper in some warm water. The warm water helps break down the fibers. And what you're going to do is rip up all the pieces of toilet paper until it's all a big pulpy mush. Half a cup of pulpy mushed up paper. Half a cup of drywall compound. Half a cup of your Elmer's glue or any glue of your choice. Add 3 tablespoons of your mineral oil. Add your flour. And now we add the corn flour and knead that until you get the consistency you like. In my case, I'm like totally a sensoried out person, so sensory sensitive, so I like to use a spoon to get it started. So now that we got our smooth clay paper mache recipe done, it's time to get it onto the mask. As you can see, the texture is much smoother from this paper mache recipe. I think had I not added as much cornstarch, this would have been enough to have done a last coat to smooth it all out, but I just put too much in and it was like working with bread dough and it just didn't work all that well. I think my next step is going to be putting a thin layer of drywall compound as my final layer. That will hopefully even out some of these smaller divots and give me a soundable surface. Now in the movies, you can't quite tell if the mask has texture or not, as most of the animation doesn't really carry much texture, but my interpretation of the no face is that it is quite smooth, probably almost porcelain given the culture. So I'm gonna try for that. Now this isn't going to be totally flat and even. I wasn't able to level all of this out properly. Of course, the more you add to this as you work, the more it kind of warps the stuff underneath, and even with the template below, I still got a bit of sags here and there, but I'm not too worried about it at this point. I just kind of want to get moving on to the next step. So I'm going to sand this smooth. I'm going to use a fine grit drywall sanding block for the edges to try to even them out a little bit. Use the 400 grit to get rid of all these little lines and try to level it out as much as this is going to allow me to do. I used a spatula, so of course I could only get it so smooth, so there's a lot of lines in here. Now in this corner you can see where it is nice and smooth, and it is much more evened out and levels than the rest of the mask. This is where I use the 400 grit sandpaper. Quick note, when it comes to the joint compound, the paper mache clay underneath is not going to sand as easily as a joint compound, and that is where my leveling got lost. Because I sanded thinking that the clay part was going to flatten down with it, but it didn't, so the joint compound went down and that part did not. So take note of that when you put your joint compound on top, that when you go to sand, it is not going to sand at the same rate as the paper mache clay underneath. So if you're using this to level out to some degree, be careful how much you sand, otherwise you're going to be right back to where you started. And then you're going to, throw another layer on there like me and wait forever for it to dry again, just to do it again. Many hours later of fighting with joint compound and sanding and cleaning and sanding and cleaning and sanding and cleaning and filing, I am at a point where I'm content enough with it that I can move on to the next stage. I've been recommended to use this product, Gesso, however you pronounce that, as the final coat on my cat, as a final coat on top. This is supposed to help seal the drywall compound and give it a nice waterproof layer. It is also supposed to help level out just some of these pinholes here that I couldn't quite sand out, and the one my cat just put in. So there's that. And it creates a paintable surface. So this is the last step of preparing the mask. Now I'm probably going to do a single layer tonight because it is 2 in the morning and I want to be done. And I will probably put on another layer in the morning because it dries fast. And then I can get on to the next step, and that'll be painting. That'll be part